Hello, everyone. Welcome back to RotoViz Overtime on RotoViz Radio. This is a special edition, Sean, of the podcast. It is a main event draft over at the FFPC. $2,000 to jump into this contest. We didn't get the luck of the draw, I guess we'll say. We'll see how the draft plays out, though. Maybe it is the luck of the draw. We get the 107 spot. By ADP, usually those first kind of 5-6 guys we really like. So it'll be interesting to see if we get squeezed into a little bit of a decision here at that 7 slot. Sean, how are you feeling as we get ready to jump into things? The draft, I'm going to pull up the board here now. It starts off Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, Jonathan Taylor. So we pull up the board. But how are you feeling about the 107 slot? And we were just touching on it briefly before we started. If we get caught out, we may have an interesting selection here for ourselves.
Yeah, I think in the big picture, the 107 being there in the middle is going to be great. It gives us a lot of flexibility. It gives us a chance to grab values as they drop. In the first couple of rounds, it may not be ideal, right? You're likely to miss on Jamar Chase. He goes one pick right ahead of us. And now we have a lot of guys with similar values. The problem with the 107 is that if you also pass on tight end, you could end up without an elite tight end in this format, which is so elite tight end heavy. All three of those tight ends are likely to go before our next pick. Colin, if we're looking at tight end, and definitely make a case for a running back if you have a preference, or Diggs or Devontae Adams. I do have Kyle Pitts ranked number 1. I have a lot of him, but I mean, this is the main event. We want to go with our board. We want to go with the best guys.
Yeah, so I'm open to the Kyle Pitts pick. Obviously, by ADP, it would be Kelsey. So I'm on board, though, if we want to go Pitts and really spice this thing up a bit. We say we put our money where our mouth is, Sean. Maybe it's time to really put $2,000 where our Kyle Pitts conversations have led us over the last couple of months. So we do go Kyle Pitts at the 107. By ADP, obviously, Travis Kelce usually would go in that slot. I would expect Travis Kelce to go off the board in the next couple of picks. You mentioned he actually goes off the board in the next selection. You mentioned, though, by ADP, how things could potentially play out over the course of the rest of this kind of next 7 or 8 picks. But usually in that scenario, Kyle Pitts may squeeze back to us, but you could get priced out off tight end. If we didn't go Kyle Pitts there, would you? Who would have been the next player in line? I'm probably leaning Stephon Diggs. We also have Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry would be potential options, but I would probably lean Diggs there if we didn't go with the tight end. So I'm kind of thinking we go tight end there, and then the options that we may have actually considered taking at wide receiver may still be there for us in the next round. That may not work out, but we can dream. Who would have been your selection if we didn't go Kyle Pitts?
That's really the tricky part. And yesterday got the 28 priority picks article up. That's one that people had liked from the last couple of years, sort of working through basically the entire draft, but definitely those first 13, 14 rounds. And looking at priority picks, draftable guys we're going to draft when they fall. We've been running really hot with that for the last several years. I have tried to point out that with the aggressiveness that we take, that's not going to be the case every year, but it's going to give us a lot of super teams. Colin, I've been doing this for about 14 years in high stakes pretty seriously. I would say about 10 of those seasons, the picks have been very, very good. About 4 of the years, the teams finish more middle of the pack. And we talk about, you can make compromise selections in every year, but then you're just going to finish middle of the pack anyway, most of the time. So from that perspective, then, the one area in the draft that is tough is the back end of the first round, because I don't think that you have any priority picks there. You've got a lot of guys that you like sort of when they fall, right? Mm-hmm. Saquon Barkley, the perfect player when he falls a little bit. DeAndre Swift, you're trying to get a good price on him. I really like CeeDee Lamb and Devontae Adams as wide receiver options to play the turn, but they're not slam dunks like we've had in so many years at the wide receiver position in that range. I think I would have gone Barkley if not for Pitts. I also do have a lot of Barkley. Most of it is more at the turn than at the 107. Who would you have gone with?
I think I would have went with Diggs there. You mentioned Lamb as well. Usually if I'm at the back end of that first round, maybe 11, 12, I am usually leaning into Lamb then as the next option after Diggs. You mentioned, though, Barkley. Barkley goes at the 11 here. Swift goes at the 12. So since our selection, it has gone all running backs bar Travis Kelce at the next pick. So it is looking okay for us. I would have had an interesting conversation if Barkley or Swift get back to us. They obviously aren't going to. Diggs goes then, but there is a chance here that the players who I would have potentially leaned to in CD Lamb, or you mentioned Devontae Adams, I think if one of them get back to us here would be an ideal situation. Mark Andrews goes off the board as well. So unless we get wide receiver, and it's both CD Lamb and Devontae Adams here, we would have options at those. That was my hope when we take Pitts at the point we did. Is that what your hope is? And
it is. I mean, I do expect Devontae Adams and CD Lamb to be the next two picks. So I think we have to be prepared to take either Alvin Kamara or Javonte Williams, Deebo Samuel, Tyreek Hill. Those would really be the four guys that we're looking at in the next wave. Joe Mixon, obviously not someone we're looking at there. Do you have a preference of that next quartet?
CD Lamb, if he can last one more pick here, is the preference. After that, I think I'm Devontae Adams at that particular point. Obviously, my love for T. Higgins is well known, and my fist goes into the air, Sean. That is because Tyreek Hill goes off the board. I have CD Lamb here not quite a bit, but in a gap ahead of Deebo Samuel. So he would be my selection here. Is that where you're going?
It is. I selected him at the 111 in the Apex Experts draft. I think the combination of upside, potential volume, solid quarterback play. At times, it's appeared that the Dallas Cowboys receivers have perhaps been elevated above what really is justified by how Dak Prescott has played. And yet, he's definitely in that echelon of signal callers where you're going to give him a little bit of a boost because of the overall scoring environment for the offense as a whole and for the potential efficiency that the individual receivers could get. If you're going to play a volume situation, I think you want to play it on an ascending type player with Lamb where the upside is really significant as opposed to kind of being a just beat ADP type of move. It's also a situation there where from a build perspective, I do like that zero RB, as Ben and I discussed in yesterday's Stealing Bananas, has become much easier to play in the last several weeks. The running back situations have crystallized in a way that make a lot of the late round picks at that position very tantalizing. And you just don't want to get caught out by the wide receiver avalanche that we are going to see as we get a little bit deeper into this draft. This format is very receiver heavy. I think that we're going to see the overall $1 million team come from obviously a draft that's very wide receiver heavy, but the potential for that to be a zero RB team this year. And again, you don't have that many pure zero RB teams. So in terms of number of total representatives in the field, you're looking at a smaller number. I think it sets up really nicely for that type of tournament winning team in 2022.
Yeah, and don't lie, Sean. You think that the winning team is coming from the number 7 slot in this draft? I think that's clear at this point. I'm really pleased with how those first two picks have went. I would have been between Diggs and Lamb that I mentioned if we went there. You made the point that you didn't think that Pitts gets back to us. In that meantime, none of the 3 top tight ends would have got back by the way we have drafted on this board. So it has worked out really well to get Pitts and Lamb. By ADP, it's probably going to be flipped for me that we take Lamb in the first round, Pitts in the second round. But to play out the way that it has is nice to start things off. It is going to give us a lot of flexibility now from those middle spots. I didn't really have a huge amount of optimism that Lamb would get back. Tyreek Hill, as I mentioned, with that one spot ahead of us. Since that, there was Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara. Josh Allen goes to the spot out of the number 4 who took Cooper Kupp, which is interesting. You hope that you see some selections like that throughout the draft. So as things have kicked off, there is 3 teams that have kicked off with a running back start. You mentioned the wide receiver avalanche. It would be nice to see some more running backs go off the board between here and our next pick. AJ Brown goes off the board. Michael Pittman, who continues to rise, goes at the 211. Brown at the 212. I really like where we're here, though, Sean. If we can get a wide receiver in the range that we're hoping to, like some of the guys that are available, which not all of these guys are going to come back to us, but Deebo Samuel, T. Higgins, DJ Moore, Cortland Sutton, Mike Williams are all kind of options. Mike Evans is kind of not really on the board at current ADP for us in these drafts. And I think that there's going to be some options for us here. We are 4 picks away. Leonard Fournette goes off the board. Travis Etienne, Aaron Jones. This is starting to, Nick Chubb, Sean, this is starting to get tantalizing here at this point.
Yeah, it looks really good. I mean, we've got a shot at Deebo Samuel making it to the 307, in addition to concerns about how that offense is going to play out overall. We also have some issues potentially with his health as the season embarks. That, combination of factors there makes him a dropper. And there are lots of other good options. You can see why drafters would go in a different direction. You mentioned a lot of the players here. He does go one spot right ahead of us. So now we're looking at T. Higgins, DJ Moore, perhaps Cortland Sutton. I would probably have us lean to Mike Williams with sort of 2 similar players there. We already know that Chargers offense is going to be a juggernaut. Also, the chance to take Gabe Davis early. He does play in that original Thursday night game. And, maybe a first round pick in those Friday and Saturday drafts after that game. So many
30 seconds on the clock. I'm going to jump in. The talk on Twitter this week has been filibustering, Sean, and I'm going to have to jump in before we get to that point. There's 23 seconds left. For me, T. Higgins would be the pick I would make. You mentioned DJ Moore would be another option. I would have them as my top 2 here. I would also play the ADP game and see if those other guys get back. How do you feel about T. Higgins? I know you like him, but do you like those other guys more? I'm just thinking by ADP, I think there's a chance with how this draft is potentially started that we could potentially see somebody like a Mike Evans or a DJ Moore maybe sneak back through to, as you mentioned, Gabe Davis. He really feels like a prime target for us here if things work out for us and it comes back to us in the 4th round.
Yeah, just looking at main event ADP over the last 3 or 4 days, Davis is at the 3-4 turn. I don't think that he will come back. We do get a couple of picks discount on T. Higgins. We like to be able to put him there with a team that has CeeDee Lamb. That probably will be a little bit unusual. DJ Moore, Mike Williams, I mean, those guys perhaps have the upside of a little bit more volume. I mean, DJ Moore could completely and totally take over that Carolina passing attack. And yet, if anything were to happen to Jamar Chase, and we do have him on a lot of teams, then T. Higgins, I think, becomes really a borderline first-round pick. He has that much upside. This offense is going to be that good. One of the things I've been a little bit surprised by this season, and I know that there are some late-year concerns about strength of schedule and weather, but Joe Burrow with those 2 guys, probably a little bit discounted in fantasy. You look at where he's going in relationship to Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes. You look at how close on his heels we have players like Tom Brady and Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott. He looks like a value. He looks like someone we could take in this particular draft. You mentioned that some of those players were fall. One of the reasons why I do want to take our favorite target in round 3 is I think round 4 is absolutely loaded. And in fact, round 5 in the first half of round 5 is loaded enough that we have so many options. We don't necessarily need a faller. In fact, in some drafts, you might even reach for a 4th round ADP player in the middle of the 3rd. It's strong enough. And in some cases, I think actually better than the guys going in round 3. But T. Higgins, one of our favorites here. This has been a really fun start.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Deebo Samuel, I know you've had some concerns around, how he may be using the offense, the contract situation now, the kind of little lingering injury. There would have been a lot of concerns there, but I do think if he had fallen to us, it would have been an interesting spot. But CeeDee Lamb, if he hadn't have gone, I would have probably went with Deebo or T. Higgins at that point. So then to get Higgins back to us in the 3rd, I think is obviously very, very strong. Mike Williams did go a pick after that. Since that, then Cortland Sutton is gone, DJ Moore is gone. So we have lost a few of those guys. I'm always trying to read between the lines, Sean. There's a few of these guys that I feel like I am overly high and optimistic on, that you're maybe just not as high. Higgins may be one of those guys you mentioned. If it was a solo Sean Siegel draft there, do you go Mike Williams over T. Higgins?
No, I don't think so. I think it's got to be Higgins. I've taken him as early as the 203, 204 in order to pair him with Stephon Diggs and get that week 17 game in. tournaments where that's even a little bit bigger factor. Obviously, in this particular format, we're looking at weeks 15 through 17 together. We want that long stretch of dominance. So it's not as important to think in terms of specifically the week 17 game. But again, I mean, Gabe Davis has the upside to do it in multiple weeks during that stretch. He hasn't gone off the board yet. Colin, one of our targets, Jalen Waddle, does go. He's someone where a lot of his fall has seemed to be related to the inability to practice. And then you put that next to the fact that Tyreek Hill has really impressed in Dolphins camp. You can see why their ADPs have continued to pull apart. I think that makes sense, but I still would have Waddle as a strong target if he had made it to us.
Yeah, Waddle there would have been my preferred target, and then Davis. You've mentioned Davis. We have 2 picks to go, so we're really on the edge here if we go for Davis. The other player in our queue then is Deontay Johnson. I've added Amon-Ra St. Brown as well. Yeah, I would be happy as well with Johnson. I think I have Davis and Johnson in a tier. And as I say, that Terry McLaurin goes. So there's one selection. If we get both options, is Davis the clear target for you here?
Not necessarily the clear target. I mean, you're talking about Deontay Johnson, someone who we featured in a bunch of articles as maybe the most undervalued receiver in all of football. And I think that becomes increasingly the case now that Kenny Pickett has looked like the real deal. Now, there's a difference between looking like the real deal against some backups in preseason games when everyone's playing vanilla compared to looking like the real deal when the season starts. But when you have a guy who played extremely well last year in college, is picked in the first round, does a great job in the preseason, has all of these weapons, Johnson's quarterback play could significantly improve in 2022. Mentioned that Ben Roethlisberger toward the bottom in air conversion, despite also being toward the bottom in target depth over the last couple of years. His fantasy points over expectation last season, tragically bad. Deontay Johnson looks like a great pick here in the middle of the 4th round.
Yeah, and we did miss out on Gabe Davis just by one selection before that. I have them guys both very, very close. And yeah, I just wanted to get one of them. I was nervous there for a little bit before that Terry McLaurin pick that we were going to miss out on them all. It does, Sean, look like a draft of 2 different styles from that midpoint of the first round in terms of selection. So 1 through 5, we see teams with a lot more running backs through those rosters. But then from our pick onwards at 7, the team after us has an identical structure so far. They have Kelsey, Hill, Mike Williams, and Gabe Davis. Then we have the team after that, Dalvin Cook, Devontae Adams, Keenan Allen, Terry McLaurin. Then we have a little bit of a different at 10, but team 11 as well as a hero RB build with Saquon Barkley, Stephon Diggs, Cortland Sutton, Allen Robinson. So the teams after us, Sean, I was hoping we would see a few running backs in there. We really seen just the 1 running back and 1 tight end. We seen a wide receiver really hammered from our pick all the way through to come back to us. And then we see another 2 selections after that, Marquise Brown and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So between the 305 and then the 308, we see 14 wide receivers go to just 2 other positions. So there was a bit of a wide receiver avalanche there, but thankfully we've been able to survive it. You mentioned some of the targets in the following round. We are going to be into the Jerry Jeudy sweepstakes, DK Metcalf sweepstakes. They're kind of my 2 preferred options in here. Chris Godwin goes in this range. Any other preferences for you? I know I like to talk about bye weeks. I bring bye weeks up from time to time. We do have 2 wide receivers with week 9 bye weeks. We could also have Jerry Jeudy with a week 9 bye week. But with it being a managed setting, I'm never as concerned with the bye week situation versus when you're doing best ball drafts. Any concerns? No concerns? Bye weeks don't matter? Which can't be fun?
I mean, all else being equal, would love to balance them out. It is a situation, as you mentioned, that we can work through that in a managed format. First and foremost, you're trying to win your individual league. You're making sure that you make it through to the postseason. You want to have a bye and get those regular season dollars for being in the first 2. So from that perspective, not losing a bunch of guys at the same time can be helpful. But yeah, the key here is that we are trying to build a team to win the $1 million. That's one of the reasons why this tournament, which has always been fun, just has even a little bit more pizzazz as we jump from 2021 to 2022. That $1 million grand prize. I was going to say, I don't think that any of those guys are going to come back, because one of the issues of having all of the teams on that half of the draft be so running back heavy is they need to take all wide receivers coming back through. Of course, we don't know for sure that they're going to do that. The pick here that I would argue for is Rashad Bateman. I think that he has immense upside as an all-around wide receiver, vertical threat, intermediate threat, underneath threat in this offense where they have Mark Andrews and not much else. But when you have Mark Andrews and Lamar Jackson, and then you're the other guy, and they've spoken so glowingly of Rashad Bateman, his prospect profile was absolutely fantastic. I had him as the best pick in round 5 of drafts in the article that just came out. And the little bit extra here is that they play the Falcons in week 16. They play the Steelers in week 17. We already have receiving threats from both of those lineups. I want those games to be shootouts.
Yeah, well, that's quite an interesting sell that you've done there, Sean. In terms of having to sell Rashad Bateman to me, I think I had already bought a ticket to that show if he manages to get back to us. But I think we're going to have some options here. Judy is still on the board. Metcalf's on the board. You mentioned Bateman. He is still there. Darnell Mooney as well in this range. So we are 3 picks away. We're going to have a choice. I'm going to move Bateman to the top of the queue. We can then decide if we have to go between those guys, depending on how it plays out. But yeah, you mentioned that we were going to have a run. The interesting part about the wide receivers that have been selected was Brandon Cooks, Elijah Moore, who we do like, but we've kind of been playing the Garrett Wilson side of things, then Juju Smith-Schuster. So a little bit below the ADP range of what we were kind of talking about just before that. Jerry Jeudy does go 1 selection before Sean, or 2 selections before. So the key here is this next pick not being Rashad Bateman, but by ADP, I think we should be okay here. Metcalf and Godwin, Michael Thomas are all ahead of him here.
They are in terms of how the players are listed, but he has actually been the guy going in the last 3 or 4 days. He selected that part. I think is frustrating. I would be fairly happy really to take Breece Hall at this juncture and let the wide receiver position go for a round, but I'm not pushing that. We do have Justin Herbert is available here with so many good quarterbacks later. It's probably not a priority. Metcalf, Mooney, Godwin, I do like all 3 of those guys. They do allow us to continue to build out.
I think now this, you can go veto this if you want. I think we should push wide receiver because I do think these other teams after us are following some sort of RotoViz game plan here that are going to start to push it on us a little bit. So that would be my reason to pass off on Breece Hall here. But if you want to, you can veto me. DK Metcalf would be my selection.
Okay, so we'll go DK Metcalf right there. You can pull up the game split app at RotoViz and see that he actually was much better last year when Geno Smith was the quarterback than when Russell Wilson was pulling the trigger. That's a good reminder that splits can be very misleading, because if you had the choice for who you would want to be the quarterback this season in Seattle, everyone would pick Russell Wilson. It is the reason that a player who, I mean, we're just like 18 months removed from DK Metcalf being the number 1 receiver in Dynasty, right? He's still big. He's still a massive touchdown threat. They have appeared to make the decision to go with Geno Smith. Anytime that you have sort of that type of quarterback battle, I don't think that you want to get all rah-rah and feel like it's definitely done and there wouldn't be any other changes during the course of the year. But we know very definitively that Drew Lock can't play. So I think that this is a situation where he can rely on Geno Smith. I think he can be one of those guys who is a bottom 10 NFL QB, but not like bottom 3. And if you stay out of that group, I think the quarterback can still move the offense. The Seahawks don't look like they'll be awesome. They play in this division in football that maybe the absolute best the competition there would be with the AFC West, but they're going to be chasing the Cardinals, chasing the 49ers, chasing the Super Bowl champion Rams throughout the year. They're going to need to score some points. Now, obviously, they want to go through Rashad Penny. They want to go through Ken Walker. They're going to need to use their big studs at wide receiver and tight end.
So since we selected Sean, we see Patrick Mahomes go to the Travis Kelce owner, stacks those up. We have David Montgomery going off the board, Michael Thomas, then Chris Godwin, Damian Pierce. His ascent continues. That is the 5-12 where he goes off the board here in the main event. Out of those guys, Chris Godwin may have been a tentative option, but I think the way it's played out there since our last pick is really good for us. Hopefully it continues to play out on the way back. The players that we did talk about previously that the discussion was about Breece Hall. Breece Hall is still there, so we may have to have that discussion if he's there in 4 picks time again. Darnell Mooney, who I mentioned, who probably would have been my second option after DK Metcalf, is still there. Then we kind of maybe starting to look into maybe even TJ Hawkinson, Sean. Even though we have Kyle Pitts, we could really load up on tight end. We're going to have an option of one of those guys. Based on what we've done so far, Breece Hall does go off the board, so his slide finishes at the 602. So we're kind of into the wide receiver or tight end discussion here. But what are your thoughts as we wait just a couple more picks here?
Yeah, Darnell Mooney makes it a couple more spots that you'd have to consider him very, very strongly. I continue to believe that Bears offense is going to be a little better than people think. That doesn't mean it's going to be some type of blitzkrieg, fast-paced, super high-scoring attack. But all of the volume plays that are out there, Darnell Mooney is easily the best one of those, both in terms of overall upside and in terms of price related to ADP. We do have some shots at various quarterbacks. Herbert still there. Hurts, Murray, Burrow, Lance obviously still there. J.K. Dobbins is probably a consideration for round 7. He is just absolutely cratered over the last 3 or 4 days. Brandon Ayuk, the other receiver with an ADP in this range. And then, there's never too early to start looking at Drake London and Devontae Smith.
Yeah, so we're no surprise to the listeners. We're very much in line here with the guys that we're hoping to head on. But so far so good, Sean, in terms of how it's playing out for us. We have 1 pick to come off the board before our pick. We are on the board now. Darnell Mooney went 1 pick before, which is disappointing. He would have been a priority pick for me there. But TJ Hawkinson is there, Sean, who we briefly talked about. Which way are you leaning? Could be interesting here to go with Hawkinson.
It could be. One of the tricky parts about Hawkinson is just that there are other weapons in that passing game. I'm not worried about his efficiency. He was hurt and triple teamed last year. How efficient can you be in that situation? The offense is going to take a big step forward. But maybe it takes a big step forward through Amon-Ra and Chark and Swift and the other guys. Brandon Ayuk has been the breakout star of 49ers camp. You now have some mild injury concerns with Debo. To me, he feels like the guy who could be the real league winner and tournament winner at this price.
Yeah, he's the next wide receiver for me. So you want to go Ayuk here, yeah?
Yeah, so we go Ayuk. We push Hawkinson. Drake London, Devontae Smith, both interesting. They have late round 7 ADPs, so they could get back to us. Colin, a lot of drafters are going to be looking at this and saying, you guys got a good start with Pitts and then the 4 wide receivers, but why did you take a 5th wide receiver? Why are you looking at a 6th wide receiver?
Why are you looking at a 7th wide receiver, Sean?
Yeah, I would...
haven't even drafted him. It's coming.
I would still make the case for Breece Hall as having been a good pick in the previous round. In the article looking at the priority targets, I mentioned Le'Veon Bell and having almost 100% of him in 2013. He was a 5th and 6th round pick. He was a 2nd round 21-year-old rookie. He began the season injured, missed the first 3 games, and then came out and despite poor efficiency, lit the world on fire from a fantasy perspective. I think that Breece Hall has the potential to do something similar and is not even hurt. He just is in this offense that fantasy managers are currently selling. Once Hall is gone, the running backs that we have a shot at here are essentially the exact same level as the running backs that we're going to have a shot out in round 10, round 11, round 12. We can take a lot of those guys. And as the NFL has developed over the past 3, 4, 5 seasons, we are seeing even more talent in some of those committee backfields to where, outside of Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor at 1 and 2, and we may be drafting running backs in the double-digit rounds who are more talented than virtually everyone else who's been drafted so far.
Yeah. And to be honest, you mentioned Dobbins, then Brees Hall. They're kind of the only two guys. I have been drafting Tony Pollard when he falls, but outside of those guys, I am happy to hold off until we get to those kind of true zero RB guys. I just think there's a lot of talent, particularly in the 9-10 range and drafts this year. So we'll see. I think too, Sean, you kind of mentioned why would we be taking, now moving on to Brandon Ayuk to have that fifth wide receiver at this particular point with the tight end. The thing is like we want to blow away these other teams in this league. We see so far through the draft, and just to reflect on some other boards, Team 1 is on the clock, but they currently have 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs, 1 tight end. We'll see what they do with this next pick. We do have a team that's 3 wide receivers. They take Jalen Hurts, a quarterback, so they pair that up with A.J. Brown, which is interesting. We have 3 running backs, 3 wide receivers. We have a 3 running back, 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end, 1 quarterback team. We have a 1 wide receiver, 1 quarterback, 1 tight end, 3 wide receiver team. We have a 3-3. We have a 3-2. A lot of these teams that were trying to match us at one point that it was looking interesting. I think we kind of want to push the advantage at wide receiver there and kind of blow them out of the water. Drake London, who you mentioned, did also go off the board. So we'll see how it plays out on the way back. He would have been a very interesting player had it lasted. My probably main target at this point, we've talked about Adam Thielen. Alan Lazard isn't really a target for me. I know Curtis Patrick is talking some very positive conversations around Alan Lazard in recent weeks. But when we look down through it, I am into the Devontae Smith or Joe Burrow kind of range here to see who else that's in an option here would be of interest to you.
Kyler Murray is, when we look at these guys who were on the best pick in every round article, I mean, those are the guys who I do think we want to target. He's the player with just immense upside. You talk about someone who was scoring over 30 fantasy points per game when he was injured in 2020, came back last year, was playing very well before he was injured again. He goes to the very experienced and talented draft team at the 5 spot. So that's a little bit disappointing. I would have loved to have had him on the roster. We also lose Joe Burrow in the pick right ahead of ours. That makes it pretty easy probably to go with Devontae Smith here.
Yeah, he would be the clear option. Dobbins is the other player that's still available that we kind of touched briefly on. But for me, it is Devontae Smith. Hopkins would be another potential name there, but Devontae for me is the winner. Disappointing there. You mentioned Kyler. If Kyler goes and it's Joe Burrow versus Devontae, I think I'm waiting to see Joe Burrow. I think may have, in some drafts will probably get back to the mid-8th range. If it was a case that all 3 are there, you going Kyler, and then if it's a case that it's Joe Burrow versus Devontae Smith, what would you have done there for the listeners?
I think that as much as I've talked about how valuable Joe Burrow is, he is a player, unlike the vast majority of the rest of the quarterbacks, where in tournament formats, I like him the best when you have Jamar Chase or you have T. Higgins. He does go to the drafter right ahead of us, who, not surprisingly, was the Chase drafter. I think in this format, which is a managed format, you can get streaming options. You can play the really deep players. You can play someone like a Malik Willis if he breaks out at the end of the season. You have so many different ways to play this. The quarterbacks should fall. They have fallen here in some ways. At least Justin Herbert was a faller. I think that if Joe Burrow gets past the Jamar Chase draft in round 7, then you're probably hoping to push him back to your own spot in round 8. And that's actually pretty close to where his ADP is. So from that perspective, I think that going Devontae Smith would have still been the play. Kyler Murray, the guy with the upside, the guy who has the Atlanta Falcons, a team that we're obviously banking on very heavily with the Kyle Pitts selection in the first round. He has them in week 17. I think that element, again, is kind of fun when you're talking about, well, how do you win the $1 million? How do you get across maybe a couple of teams that are ahead of you for that prize? He would be someone who is interesting from that perspective.
There is one quarterback that that may get back to us that could be very interesting in Trey Lance. So as things play at the moment, Team 12, Team 11, Team 9 on the way back to us have no quarterback. Team 10, Team 8 have. So I'd expect them to pass on quarterback here. Lance usually goes in that he usually goes in the early 9th range, but how would you feel about Lance with the rushing upside that he has in this next round? Some of the other players that we're probably looking at, we're kind of getting into that 0 RB range. Rashad Penny, Devin Singletary, those guys are probably going to be in the mix here as well.
Yeah, I think you can probably push it one more round and get one of those upside rookies. One of the things that has happened in this draft is that because we were able to take so many receivers early, we don't have the youth to the extent that we sometimes have from the perspective of just straight rookies. Obviously, the players we have are young. CeeDee Lamb going into year 3, T. Higgins going into year 3, Brent Ayuk going into year 3, Devontae Smith going into year 2. It's a team that has explosive upside, and yet Trey Lance with that mid-9th round ADP, there's only one team in between us and him going through 8 and coming back to 9 that doesn't have a QB.
Yeah,
now, if that team does take a quarterback, you would expect it to be Trey Lance. But there are some other options with the way that he played in the 3rd preseason game. It wouldn't be a surprise to see Russell Wilson or Tom Brady go ahead of him.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was kind of thinking that if he does make it to that point, that was my next question: is do we risk to see if it comes back? So I think that is probably where we'll lean. We'll see how it plays out, and then that gets us in, Sean, to the conversation of wide receivers that would be available. Would be Hopkins, who I mentioned, Kadarius Toney, Chris Olave. Then we're looking at the likes of Cole Kmet at tight end, potentially Pat Fairmouth, but we do have the Pitts pick obviously already. We are into the 0 RB range with Penny, Singletary, Harris, who I already mentioned. I think it'll be very appetizing to probably take one of those guys here at this particular point. Do you think that's the case, or do you want to hold off a little bit longer at running back?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get somebody good in round 9, so we don't necessarily need to push it here, but it is a situation where you can only take one player in each round, right? Sometimes it's easy to forget that. You're like, there are so many guys in round 9 that I like. I don't need to take that player in round 8. And then you get to round 9, you're like, oh, I still haven't really addressed that position. Our question here is between Lance and I think that Treylon Burks is probably the receiver that I would be looking at, especially with this team where we're not going to need to rely on him in the first month. His late season upside is still just through the roof, probably the most of any rookie wide receiver, maybe outside of Drake London, who is the clear-cut top receiver in fantasy this year from that rookie class. Well, we're looking at him, we're looking at Trey Lance, we're looking at Devin Singletary and Rashad Penny. Within the next 2 rounds, we can obviously just take 2 players and only 2 positions. So from that perspective, Colin, looking at kind of backwards and forwards, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking that I think we'd be better off overall if we take a running back and then try to get Trey Lance is probably my preferred option. I am open to the other options that you mentioned. Now, I may have my filter set to slightly longer than yours, but over the last couple of days, we do see Treylon Burks usually go late 2nd round. Now, that may not happen in this draft, but I would be willing to take the risk and let him slide by as much as I do like him with what we have assembled already at wide receiver.
So we're back up. We have the option of Penny, Singletary, and Lance. We had no quarterbacks go to the 3 teams on that half of the draft who didn't have QBs, so they're all waiting. I'm getting the vibe that you want Rashad Penny and agree with Ben's and my contention. Said it on the show. Ben didn't flagrantly disagree that Rashad Penny is maybe as good or better pick than Nick Chubb straight up right now.
That's a bold prediction. It was a bold prediction episode though, Sean. Yeah, I'm willing to go. You're the 0 RB guy. Don't ask me to pick the running backs. You pick the running backs here. This is how we win. But we do take Penny. Singletary is my guy, but we like all these guys. And I think again, playing the ADP game, Cook did go off the board a couple of picks before us. That's James Cook. I think there's potential that Singletary may slide back. The one thing I would be interested in, I don't think I will play this out when we get to that point. I'm always interested when you get to this point, if you've really hammered the wide receiver position, got your tight end, we get into this range. I do like where possible to get 2 of those top end 0 RB candidates from Sean's articles. And, we have Penny there. I mentioned the other names that are in it. Singletary is obviously there. Harris is there. So I would be interested in that, but I do think if Lance slides back with having Ayuk as well, it would be very hard to pass that up with the Russian upside. But we are waiting for the selection here. We were talking about Trey Lance. The team at number 2 has gone Cole Kmet. Then on the way back, they've gone Sky Moore. So it feels like we may be opened up to an option of having Trey Lance here. We were talking a little bit when we took a little break there about potential options with the quarterback position, whether we wait, whether we try then later to pair him for certain playoff scenarios with a different quarterback. Treylon Burks was the other player you did mention that we did pass on. Devin Singletary goes off the board at the 903. So Treylon Burks could be back in play here. Who, before I tell you who I want, let's go through what Sean wants.
Well, we've set this up exactly to take Lance. Still believers in his overall profile. One of the things I would note is that throughout the course of the offseason, the other QB that I have huge exposure to, and I think is actually pretty similar, is Justin Fields. Now, he doesn't have the weapons. He doesn't necessarily have the coaching from the perspective of the coaching staff having been there, been established, the continuity, all of those types of things that we see with Lance and being in the second season under this coaching staff that has taken the 49ers to such heights. But everything else very positive there. The reports in the early going on their new OC are glowing. And Fields got to play last year, right? So he's ahead from that perspective. The experience could be the determining factor in terms of which one of those players gets off to the fastest start. And then Lance obviously has now a little bit more pressure behind him. If he really struggles early, the 49ers are going to feel a little bit of heat to go back to the player who has led them either to the promised land or to the edge of the promised land several times.
Then we can just spend our entire waiver budget on Jimmy Garoppolo and we'll be okay.
Hopefully at that point we can be spending our waiver budget on Malik Willis or Desmond Ridder. Marcus Mariota, the other quarterback that I think we should be looking at late in this draft as a hedge. Until the last week and a half, maybe you didn't feel like you needed a hedge for Lance in managed leagues where obviously you're going to be starting one quarterback a week. Now I think having some of those other upside plays late, guys who have the hybrid upside and are still just super cheap, you probably want to put one of those players on your roster as well. But we also have a lot of deep running back candidates that we like in those rounds. So it's going to be a difficult discussion when we get there, right? It's never easy. You always have players at the end of drafts, certainly at least in 13, 14, 15, 16 that you like. Sometimes 17 through 20 can be a little bit different. The 19th and 20th rounds, always exciting, always a little bit of a minefield. You do know that you're going to be churning those players on waivers over the first month of the season. And so you have that conflict between trying to get perhaps an elite kicker and not having to worry about constantly making waiver picks to get into games that are going to be a little bit more high scoring, that type of thing, versus waiting for the 19th and 20th rounds because there is that drop off from round 17, 18. Colin, take us through some of the guys who've been picked since we selected Trey Lance.
Yeah, so we took Lance, then it's Jahan Dotson and Miles Sanders. Before that, we did see one of the guys we really do like, and Rondale Moore go off the board at an interesting spot there. So, Sean, I think through 9 rounds, this has probably gone as well as it can. Damian Harris goes off the board, who would have been in contention in the following round here for us. So as we look, kind of, if we are 8 picks away at this particular point, we're going to try and see what we decide to do, but I think we're lining this thing up pretty well at the moment. The one thing to note, Sean, we're back at it again with the Seahawks. We have Penny and DK Metcalf. Maybe we'll take Kenneth Walker to really load up again. We'll be targeting Noah Fant, I am sure, at a point later in the draft to get more of that Seahawks brand on our roster. But at the moment, the players that are really intriguing to me here are going to be Melvin Gordon. Kenneth Walker probably is in the mix here, but Treylon Burks, so you mentioned Kenneth Gainwell, Michael Carter, Rashad White. The dream scenario here for us is that we come away with, I think, 2 of those guys over the next 2 rounds, which will be a stretch. What are you thinking here for the names I mentioned? So Treylon Burks, Michael Carter, Melvin Gordon, Rashad White, Kenneth Walker, Naheem Hines.
Yeah, and again, running back is deep enough that we can kind of look to the players who fall in that next range. If Burks does make it, I think it would be tough to pass on him. But there are other players like Romeo Doubs and Garrett Wilson too. So it's not even a situation where it's just him. And this isn't a draft where we selected Elijah Moore. So Garrett Wilson becomes a pretty intriguing choice. And as we work back through it, having a couple of these guys here in round 10, maybe we like them a little bit better than some of the running backs. In that case, Breece Hall again, the kind of back to front drafting, thinking in terms of who's going to be there in the 9th round and the 10th round. Maybe that puts him on our radar for our next draft. You and I still plan to do some more FFPC. Again, the FFPC has just been such a fantastic contest to us, but also big picture, so much fun to play, such great customer service. But we don't know if we're going to get that pick right in the middle again. We could get the 101, 102, take Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor. We might get some of those star receivers instead of Kyle Pitts and have to try to figure out things at tight end. Round 5, 6, if you have a back third slot, can be tricky. A lot of the other areas of the draft, very strong. I think the only picks, again, that they weren't compromised picks, but in a dream scenario, Rashad Bateman would have made it one more spot to us instead of DK Metcalf. In a dream scenario, Darnell Mooney would have made it one more spot to us instead of Brandon Ayuk. Round 10, we're not going to have any of that regret because there are so many guys that we like here.
The only regret here, you mentioned that you can't take 2 picks in the 1 round. That is the only regret we're going to have here, Sean. All those players that I mentioned, since I mentioned it, none of them have gone off the board. We've seen Fairmouth go off the board, Russell Wilson, Okubunim, Matthew Stafford, Alexander Madison. Sean, spoke too early. MVS and then Treylon Burks. Treylon Burks goes 1 pick before, but we do have a lot of quality options here, and we're into the 0 RB territory again. Or do you want to go to the Dubes, Garrett Wilson tier?
Yeah, I guess I just don't feel that we have to have one of these running backs. I think somebody will come back to us in the next round. It's absurd that Garrett Wilson is going at this price, and any team that doesn't have Elijah Moore and you get him at this spot, I think that we have to take him. But I'm fine with Michael Carter, fine with Melvin Gordon, Rashad White, immense upside in any scenario where Leonard Fournette goes down. He could be the tournament winner. Maybe Garrett Wilson can't call him. We got 8 seconds.
Can I push for Rashad White, and we'll see if we get Wilson back to us?
So we take Rashad White. All you have to do is mention could be the tournament winner, and suddenly your partner's like, well, we got to take that guy. So we take White there.
It was the guy that I wanted. The situation was I was interested in him or Garden were my 2 main priorities there. I do think when we look at Garrett Wilson and Dubes, I know I've said this about Sean's players a couple of times here in the draft, and instantly they go. Hopefully that isn't the case here. I feel like one of them may slide back to us here in the next round. So I hope that isn't the kiss of death for us. But yeah, I just feel like having him, that it just gives us a real stability now where we can go and hammer the wide receivers again if we want. But I think White there is too much to pass up.
Yeah, White is a tricky running back, and that I do like him a little bit more on teams where you do have some production, maybe the 3rd running back after you've had an anchor or even double anchor build, someone who can come in and replace that early running back who gets hurt, but you got the points early. I don't think that White is going to play very much. And so that is the big reason that I haven't been taking him in 100% of drafts. maybe it's just being a little bit gun shy in the face of what happened with Leonard Fournette last year. Rachaad White may be a much better fit for what they do than Ronald Jones was. We talk about White and his physical profile, absolutely elite, immediately one of the best in football. As a bigger back, not a big back, but not one of the small backs, he has the receiving ability to go with that absolute burst when he gets into space. And so if the team falls in love with him, if Fournette goes down, you could be talking about the player who leads the NFL in high value touches. When you're trying to win $1 million, you need to have some of those players, maybe rookie wide receivers who are on bad teams in the case of Wilson, or in the case of Dobbs, may not even be a starter. Those guys, it's a little bit harder to see how they're going to win the whole tournament for you, especially when you're loaded at the receiver position. We are going to have some options at both receiver and running back who come back to us. One of the reasons I was thinking about those rookie receivers is that they do both have ADPs in the last couple of days in early round 11. And since we had such a long stretch at one point here where receivers were going, you have players like MVS going well ahead. Colin, what's your take on him? Listeners know you're a huge Green Bay Packers fan. He and Alan Lazard both struggled to really develop as volume players with Aaron Rodgers in the past. He was desperate to really get anybody to fill that number 2 role behind Davante Adams. They both failed to do that, and yet both of those guys are trendy picks this year in arguably worse situations. MVS goes to the Kansas City Chiefs. He's drafted enthusiastically in almost every redraft league, and yet in Dynasty, where I have a few shares, there is absolutely zero value. Explain that to me, because if he's going to be good, he should be good in Dynasty.
Yeah, nobody wants him. I do have him on some rosters. I can tell you, nobody wants him. I do think he's an interesting player. The thing I've always said is, like, with the Packers, he's kind of a secondary wide receiver behind Davante Adams, and when healthy, he does have a elite speed to get behind the defense in that particular offense, the way the Packers were using him. I think he'll be able to do that as well with the Chiefs. The problem is I don't think he can be the wide receiver 1 on an NFL team. So at the moment, obviously, Juju Smith-Schuster's going ahead of him. It feels like Smith-Schuster would be the wide receiver 1, but the player that I'm targeting is Sky Moore in that offense then as the secondary wide receiver. I just think that MVS is somebody who maybe in best ball leagues is going to be able to be added in and have those productive weeks. I think he's going to be a bit of a headache in redraft formats. I could be wrong. He could just turn things around and be completely healthy and continue to put up week on week scores, but I don't expect that to be the case. So I haven't been drafting him at all this year. So Sean, we are about to be back on the clock here. We are actually on the clock at this particular time. Eric Smith goes, Nico Collins, Garrett Wilson, who we talked about, did go. Dubes is there and available, though, if he is the option you want to take. We did get a little bit of a run at the running back position. Kenneth Gainwell is still there, though, who I think is very, very interesting. So I would be between Gainwell and Dubes here. I've pushed a few picks, so I'm going to let you take the wheel on this one.
Well, the other player that I think we have to consider, he's got an early 12th round ADP, but I think that he should be going in that same group with Penny and Singletary and Harris, is Raheem Mostert.
Oh, Mostert, okay. I'm on board with Mostert as well. Again, playing the ADP game, that's where I was kind of risking it a bit, but 18 seconds left, Sean. This pick is all yours.
So we throw Mostert in there to make sure that we get him. If Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle really drive that Miami Dolphins offense forward, then I think a player who has the elite speed, and you look back to 2020, Mostert had the 2 top on field with the ball in his hands times in the entire NFL. He's been injured since then, but his times at Miami Dolphins practices have once again been explosive. They released Sony Michel. That probably gives life to Myles Gaskin. That doesn't necessarily mean that Chase Edmonds and Raheem Mostert are completely and totally locked in to all of the touches, but I could see this being a situation that is a lot more similar to 2020 with the Arizona Cardinals than 2021 with the Arizona Cardinals, where Mostert is the Kenyon Drake back and Chase Edmonds really is the complement. Now, Not saying that that's going to happen. I don't think that's the most likely thing. They most likely have the player they signed to the most money and who is a little bit more, prime of his career type player as the main guy or the slight leader in that committee. But I think that the scenario in which you get a league winner out of it probably is Mostert.
Yeah, and the other key to make sure this is, I've had some fun on the recent best ball shows talking about if you're drafting 5 or 6 running backs to try and not have the same bye week. Sean, we have a managed league here, so we don't have to worry about that. And it is week 11, so we don't have to worry about that. We have drafted our 3 running backs with week 11 as our bye week, so we just have to keep that correlation going throughout the entire draft now. But I have really liked drafting Mostert over the last month or so. I was also drafting a lot of Sony Michel, which I eased up on, but I still have him as, I think, my 3rd highest drafted running back. But after he got released, there was a slight day of concern, and then hopefully things will work out now with him with the LA Chargers. But we get a 3rd running back. Dubes is still on the board. He is somebody, Sean, that I haven't got a huge amount of because he tends to go a little bit earlier than I'm willing to pull the trigger in these drafts. Algier is somebody who would still be there when things potentially come back to us. Anyone else, though, that's a clear target for you here? I have, since we were doing the Julio Jones free agent draft picks, I haven't really been drafting Julio Jones. He goes in this range. Who else is a prime target for you here with 5 picks to go?
I think it's never too early to start looking at Gerald Everett. He's the player who probably has been the most mispriced of any player in the league this season, especially in the FFPC's tight end premium. You don't want him going to a different roster. That's true, even if you do have one of the elite tight ends. One of the reasons that the bully tight end that Madison Parkhill talks about a lot is so successful in FFPC is that there are such good flex options. I'm not saying that Gerald Everett is going to be a flex starter on a weekly basis, but you have to at least consider that possibility and the possibility that by week 3, week 4, you'll know that ahead of time. And it won't be something where you're just trying to put him in there for the occasional touchdown. We're building through wide receiver as the most likely position to fill the flex on most weeks. But one of the things that we're also looking at in zero RB is that you do end up with more positional flexibility, I think, than most drafters or that many drafters realize. We get to the end of these drafts and one thing that happens is it's easy to end up too where you actually have a running back that you play in the flex. So we're not too worried about that element. We want to draft the best players, especially once we get into these double-digit rounds, especially in managed formats. I'm getting pretty enthusiastic about the potential of Romeo getting here to us. If he doesn't, Tyler Algier is one of my absolute favorites. He has an ADP in the middle of round 12. I think that he could do what Mike Davis couldn't last year and really be the guy. It's not a criticism of Cordero Patterson. He was fantastic in 2021. He is that sort of hybrid running back wide receiver to where they can run him on some routes down the field. So he gets a little bit of that air yard potential and catch some longer passes. We know he can run after the catch. He's great with the ball in his hands. But the Falcons would really like to be this dominant, physical running team where that back also does have the 3-down upside. One of the things that we saw in the preseason is that Algier caught passes a little bit better maybe than some folks were expecting, or at least if you had that concern, he probably alleviated it. Both of those guys are available here, Column. I've got myself excited about both.
Yeah, I think we have to take the Dubes pick. I actually went on to Twitter just to do a quick check to see that something hadn't happened to him. His ADP, Sean, has usually been in that 11th round range. We're into the mid-12th here. I would lean that way unless you want the Algier pick, but I think Dubes is the pick.
When we look at the preseason, Dobbs was targeted on almost like every other route, scored a touchdown on almost every other possession.
There's too much smoke there. There's too much smoke.
They talk about him as being, I mean, even Aaron Rodgers, who on the one hand is saying, I want to be all the veterans.
I seen an interview today where your boy Aaron Rodgers was talking up Dubes again. So
yeah, I mean, they talk about how he is basically the best rookie that they've had, and I don't know, Colin. They've had some pretty good guys, and so when we look at that, you can't pass on him there. I mean, he's more exciting, I think, in some ways, even in best ball, because you do get the big games when he has them. You get all that firepower from continuing to build out the receiver depth for those optimized lineups. I don't know. I mean, you get 2 or 3 weeks into the season and all that wide receiver depth that you thought you had isn't there. He is our 7th wide receiver. You also have to continue to build as though you're wrong, right? You have to not build a team where everything needs to go right, but everything could go wrong and you would still be there. Maybe the Steelers' passing attack is not where we want it to be. Maybe Geno Smith completely face plants and DK Metcalf doesn't score any points for us. Maybe CeeDee Lamb does not take the next step forward. Maybe T. Higgins is really squeezed out by Jamar Chase.
That's all before
Tyler
injuries
Boyd.
and bye weeks.
In addition to Column's biggest concern with the bye weeks, maybe these 2 hybrid QBs that we've drafted receivers from and Brandon Ayuk and Devontae Smith, maybe those teams do end up very, very run-based. If that's the case, maybe Romeo Doubs is our number 1 wide receiver column.
Hopefully that isn't the case, Sean, but yeah, you want to keep give yourself as many options to those paths to victory. But yeah, I think that's exciting to get that. I have a kind of a pretty clear break between where he goes and then the other wide receivers going in this range. You're kind of almost getting into Devontae Parker range. You have Russell Gage, who went shortly after. Isaiah McKenzie went 2 picks after. I do like KJ Osborne. He goes 1 pick before, but I think he is a clear standout in that range. But Sean, that there immediately then does put us into Gerald Everett watch, because he would be in the range here for the next round as a pick when it comes back to us. We do have 9 picks to go before we would be back on the clock. Tyler Algier, though, we talked about, he would be another option for us. You know, I don't know. There's a couple of other names, but for me, they are the really clear options that we would be hoping that one of those 2 get back. It kind of sometimes can be a little bit tricky when you get into the range where you have 2 names out of 12. It is unfortunate if both of those guys go, but there is a chance that happens. After that, then I think we're sliding down into the range where we maybe start to talk about Jerick McKinnon, Justin Fields. We're going a little bit down, and we can also talk about KJ Hamler if we want. But who are you hoping gets to us? Which is obviously now just Gerald Everett, as Tyler Algier has gone off the board. Who are you hoping gets back here for this next selection?
So Algier goes up to 12-11. That isn't a surprise. That's actually a few spots below his ADP. Gerald Everett's ADP is the 12-11. We would love for him to come back. The other issue that we're staring in the face right now is the loss of Benjamin. He goes 1 spot after Dobbs. His ADP is at the end of round 13. We're now into the range in drafts where we have to take the players we want. We can't get too worried about price. Yeah. We can't get too confident that ADP is going to push players back to us. We know that drafters are going to be taking their guys. This is a main event. You're not pushing the ADP game in these particular drafts. There are a handful of managers out there who probably are playing 20 to 30 to 40 of these. They might be going for a little bit of value hunting. The vast majority of participants in the main event, they need to be selecting their guys.
So, Sean, back on the clock again. We're going to look through the options. Gerald Everett's there. For me, I think he is the clear pick. Is that who you want to go with? I feel like it probably is.
Yeah, it has to be him. I was pretty shocked that Isaiah Likely and Evan Ingram went in the 2 picks before. That doesn't mean those are bad picks. I mean, Likely could be the guy, right? He was fantastic in college, underdrafted. We discussed in part 1, the first half of this draft, that Rashad Bateman was someone we really wanted because of the lack of other weapons in that passing attack. It could be Likely as the 3rd option, even though he's the 2nd tight end. Evan Ingram, a player who always has just that potential, right? He's a pure potential player. We know that the Jaguars are going to be a lot more fun this year. Lawrence is going to take a step forward. They don't have a brilliant number 1 to hog all the targets. So I like that pick, but I also just have to say that Ingram has not been good. Now, a lot of listeners are like, the player you just picked has not been good either. And so The difference there for me is that I think that the Chargers really need somebody to take the volume, and they have Justin Herbert, who, I mean, he's been overdrafted this season. He should probably be the QB 5 or 6 instead of the QB 2 in many formats. But that dude is an absolute star, right? If you were starting a franchise right now, you would be hard pressed in your decision between Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and Justin Herbert as the guy. You might consider some players like Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray also. In fantasy, I think those guys are even better choices in many cases. Lamar Jackson and how his rushing ability will age, the only reason that he might not be in that conversation. The three guys with the huge arms all give you the vibe right now that they could still be playing at 45 like Tom Brady is. That's why I like Gerald Everett. The reports have been good from Chargers camp and practice. And Everett's somebody who is athletic, right? He's got that upside that we're looking for. It's not just a volume play. In the last half of 2021, you can pull the Stealing Signals tool. You can see that his profile was finally good when he got a chance to play with Russell Wilson there. Obviously, both of those guys are now on different teams and will be fighting for the AFC West title. Wilson, the one who will have a lot more control over who wins it. We're about to have the last pick in round 13. Colin, who are you looking at for round 14?
So the next question I was going to pitch to you is how we're looking. Obviously, we have to take a kicker in a defense in this particular format, and we are going to, at that point, then have 5 remaining selections left. At the moment, we have 2 tight ends, 1 quarterback, 3 running backs, 7 wide receivers. KJ Hamler does go off the board, who was going to be my potentially preferred option here. With the 2 tight ends we have now in Pitts and Everett, is there any appetite to take a 3rd tight end in this draft? Noah Fant is somebody who would be in this particular range if we did think that way. And then after that, then we did talk about this earlier when we had a little break. We didn't talk about it while we were recording. But Trey Lance, somebody you talked about potentially pairing him up with, would be Justin Fields. He would be in this kind of range as well as options. We're starting to also get into the kicker and the defensive portion of it, but I don't know about you. I'm willing to stretch that out quite a bit yet. Are you looking at somebody like Justin Fields here? The running backs that we have paired up in the queue at the moment are Jarrett McKinnon, Amir Abdullah, Samaje Perine, Ronald Jones, and Karen Williams. Interesting just to ask you, while this is just a question I have for you, you have Perine in the queue. There's no sign of Chris Evans in the queue. Have you switched over to Perine over Evans for that backfield?
Well, Evans was the play as the real upside shot, but he's played himself out of that backup role in camp, apparently. One of the things that we know is that those positions can flip-flop. If you actually had a Joe Mixon injury, you might see it flip as the Bengals wanted to get the most explosive player out there. But right now, Samaje Perine is probably in that group of 10 to 12 players who should be in round 16, 17 in every draft, but either goes 19, 20 or undrafted most of the time. He's somebody for us to consider because when we think about who could be this year's Devin Singletary, who could be this year's Sony Michel, who could be this year's Rashad Penny, then, that's a name that probably should come up earlier than it does. We know the Cincinnati Bengals, a team that can score a lot of points, deliver the running backs down there into the red zone, and Perine is not a bad receiver. So you have that 3-down upside that fantasy managers crave. I would like to get multiple Chiefs down the stretch unless other drafters take that path away. We can't control. We only have 1 pick in each round, but McKinnon and Jones together, I think, is a really strong way to play at least the first couple weeks. You get to have a look at the Chiefs' backfield. It may be that neither one of those guys work out. It could very easily be a Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Isaiah Pacheco situation. If it becomes that, then you just make your moves, pick up some new guys in free agency, especially in the first month. There are going to be a lot of great options. You want to be aggressive with those free agent bids. And Colin, we are up. I think for me, the 2 players here are Justin Fields and Jarrett McKinnon.
Yeah, they're the exact two players that I was going to ask you about. In terms of, just depends on like, I'm kind of thinking that you mentioned earlier Mariota as a late round pick potentially. I'm kind of thinking almost if we don't take Fields here, we may be looking at just going with one quarterback in this build. But I think Fields has so much upside from where he's going in this particular draft. He would probably be my pick, and I would risk seeing if Jerick McKinnon gets back to us.
All right, so we're on the same page there. We want a couple of games watching Justin Fields. Colin, when we are looking at that week 15 to 17 sprint, the playoff schedules for these two teams match up fairly well. We might have a situation where we wanted to play Fields in weeks 15 and 16, play Trey Lance in week 17. If we think that Lance can only play in week 17, then maybe that's not the direction that you're wanting to go, but you don't know what the future is. You have to give yourself some flexibility. They have the Seahawks, the Commanders, and then are at the Raiders in the final weekend. That at the Raiders game at the end, I think is absolutely fantastic. I've been playing that in a bunch of best ball tournaments. You can put players from those two teams together in a very fun fashion. The Raiders have guys like Devontae Adams, Derek Carr, Darren Waller. You play those against all of those options from the 49ers. Those first two games are not necessarily hugely worrisome, but they are games that could be lower paced games where perhaps the 49ers won't need to score a lot of points. You contrast that with the Chicago Bears, who in week 15 have the Philadelphia Eagles, in week 16 have the Buffalo Bills, and in week 17 have the Detroit Lions. That's part of the sort of sneaky thesis for Fields to me. The Eagles game, you run into the potential where if the Eagles control the ball throughout the game and Chicago has some 3 and outs, maybe it's a situation or a contest where the total number of plays for the Bears is extremely low. That would be a worry, but I think the Eagles are going to score a lot of points. I think the Bears will have to chase. We know that they'll be chasing in week 16 against Buffalo, and then the week 17 road game against the Lions in the Dome. If the Lions put up the points that we're enthusiastic about them potentially putting up, again, you have a lot of third quarter, fourth quarter aggressiveness from a rising Chicago team at that point. Not necessarily saying that will happen, but that's kind of what we're thinking through when we're attacking Justin Fields in that range.
Yeah, and I just think I joked about this when we talked about potentially targeting Trey Lance. That we had Trey Lance on our main event team last year, and we never actually got to put him into that starting lineup. But we are going to put him in the starting lineup a lot this year, Sean. But having the flexibility between those two, and I feel like the Bears, who you touched on earlier when we talked about Mooney, I think there's a scenario where when the season starts, they could be a different look after week 4 than they are now. They could be a much better offense, and they could be somebody that you're looking to target. So I think just the upside of Fields and also the rushing ability, whereas even if the offense isn't great, you're still going to have that scenario that you also have with Trey Lance and his ability to run the ball. So giving you that extra flexibility. The other player we mentioned was Jerick McKinnon. He is still there, so hopefully he will make it back to us. I think he'll be a clear pick then at that point. We are 4 picks away. Sean, the question I also mentioned to you is Samaje Perine. I think the other part of that to mention is probably the fact that this is 20 rounds. 2 of those rounds are going to be kicker and defense. If we're playing in best ball, we're usually getting Chris Evans in the 19th, 20th round as well. So, obviously you don't need to lock him in. He's a potential waiver wire option if something happened to Perine, and obviously if something happened to Mixon. But is that part of the thought process there, just the immediate depth chart?
He's a really high percentage likely cut after week 1. And so when you're trying to decide between a couple of different players and one you really want to see and the other one you think is going to be a 70% cut, then you can work at that direction. It doesn't mean you're going to always be right. I mean, if we could be right about players who are being drafted in the 14 through 20 range, then these rounds wouldn't be so crazy. Fantasy would look a lot different. We can't be right on them, and yet at the same time, we do still have some information, and we want to make that information work to our benefit as much as we can. Colin,
We
Jarrett
have
McKinnon, he's
information.
here.
Yeah, we have information now that says we are on the clock and Jarrett McKinnon is available. I think clear pick for me, unless there's anyone else you want to pitch in. Obviously, the reports on Brian Robinson have been more positive than you would expected after his recent unfortunate situation, but he is still there, falling a little bit on the draft board, but maybe he's still there in the next round. We'll consider that. Other players that we're probably looking at, Sean, in the next round would include the likes of Amir Abdullah, who I did touch on earlier. I think this is the way the draft is played out and how it's setting up now for these final rounds is probably from, we had a little bit of apprehension when we joked about it before with our draft slot before we started recording from the 7, because you do miss out on those top 3 wide receivers. But the way things have played out for us throughout the draft has been pretty smooth sailing outside, as you mentioned, the Bateman pick or the Mooney pick. Everything else has been pretty good.
Yeah. We've drafted a lot of players we love. That's the key part of having teams that are easy to root for and that do have a lot of flexibility for winning you leagues. You're going to miss on some of your ideas, and so you want all of your selections to be really tilted in the direction of high upside, low downside, asymmetrical positive returns. I think that we have that type of lineup. We are going to be relying a little bit on Rashad Penny and Raheem Mostert to be perhaps healthier than they have commonly been, at least until Rachaad White can come through and be a top 6 overall running back.
Yeah, that's after, as you mentioned earlier, he's going to get no touches at the start of the season, I think was your reaction to that pick.
Very few.
So from week 6 on, though, we'll be fine. He'll be getting all the touches at that point. But yeah, I'm really pleased with how things are continuing to play out here. We will have a little bit of time here before our next pick. Alec Pierce, Marvin Jones, Kenny Galladay, Amir Abdullah, who we were hoping may get back to us, all off the board. Then we have Kirk Cousins, Mo Ali Cox, Isaiah Spiller, and Corey Davis. So Sean, 3 picks away again, or 2 selections before we would be up again. We have done a little brief conversation off recording. We might get into it here now, where it may be a flat zone for us here potentially, where we may pivot over to one of those top end kickers. Justin Tucker was the first kicker off the board in the previous round. How are you feeling here? Abdullah was kind of the main priority for us at this particular point. There's a number of wide receivers who would be available, but with the build so far, there's one particular guy, we'll not mention him yet, but we hope we may get later on. But Robbie Anderson's kind of in this range. But if you're looking tight end, Robert Tonyan, Brian Robinson, who I mentioned, would still be potentially in the mix. But who are you looking at here? And are you thinking about pivoting over to a kicker at this point?
It's so tempting, right? And especially if you take the Bills kicker, then you can take a separate kicker in round 20, only if you feel like there are no other options. But that gives you the chance to play the top guy, or at least go away from Bass if he doesn't put up a big score in the first Thursday night. We're back on the clock. Kyron Williams goes 1 pick ahead of us there. A very tiny surprise, but one of the trendy late round running backs right now. And we have P. Ryan, Ronald Jones, Ty Chandler, a name that should be on everybody's mind. Perhaps the best running back in the preseason this year. I guess David Bell is the player that I think that we need to stash and see what he has, because if he comes out of the blocks like Anquan Bolden, then that type of production, I think we'll get a little bit of a feel on early in the season.
Do you think we need to go from now?
I do.
Okay, let's do it. I think we probably, I know we talked about, I joked there a second ago, but there was a wide receiver we wanted to get later on. That wide receiver we wanted to get later on was David Bell. We have got him at this exact point. So I guess when you mentioned it earlier, go get your guys at this particular point of drafts. David Bell usually goes a little bit later, but yeah. And I think that also probably, Sean, seals us out at the wide receiver position, and then we'll see what comes back to us. So by kicker, the other part was going to be the decision. You mentioned the Thursday night football game and the benefit of potentially going with Tyler Bass. You have McPherson and Buckner as well. ahead of those ahead of Bass in terms of the kicker ADP. So he may still get back to us here, and we'll just see what happens. Brian Robinson was somebody who was kind of intriguing to me there at this particular moment. Is he somebody that you are not drafting, or is there a point where if he continued to fall, you'd be interested? I just think that he won't go undrafted, but like he's somebody who, if he is healthy after 6 weeks of the season, is somebody who would be he goes off the board. A great add to a 0 RB roster. What's your thoughts there?
He's another guy where I think you're going to have to cut him, right?
Yeah.
So
it's hard to start, like, especially that's what I was thinking is we have Penny, White, Mostert, McKinnon. We don't know McKinnon's workload is going to be early in the season. You mentioned some of the concerns around White's workload early in the season, and then that puts you in a situation where holding Brian Robinson for 6 weeks is going to be a challenge.
It is, and even if it's just the 4, then I think that you're going to have another shot at him sometime this year. Maybe a shot where you've got to throw out 600, 700 of your free agent budget to get him, but only in leagues where he lands with an inactive manager. I think is he likely to stick around. He's drafted in round 16. We know these 16, 17, 18 rounds are going to be players who get churned, not in all cases, but in a high percentage of cases. Maybe he lands on a team where there are a lot of other misses, and so you can get rid of your clear misses as opposed to someone that you're just stashing. But I think that we want to not necessarily exclusively emphasize. I mean, if you think he's going to get back and be the big time starter, you think that the Commanders are going to score a lot of points. There was a lot of reason to be enthusiastic about his profile after he more or less won the starting job, but still reasons to be worried, right? You've got a guy here who is sandwiched between a quality starter and a quality third down back or quality space back in a bad offense. If he also can't play for the first month, I mean, do you want to spend one of your important roster spots that way? We talk about how if we could tell the future, then these 16, 17, 18th round picks would be worth a lot more. But we do know that there are going to be some big hits that come out, and we do know that there are going to be some big time values in free agency. So those roster spots do matter, even if the overall hit rate during the draft is very low.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very fair point. The other thing, it's interesting, you mentioned about the inactive manager, and the question I had was more for if people were listening in just in their leagues and how they might play it out. But that manager has currently, has the wide receiver, or sorry, running back 8. That roster is 5 wide receivers at this point. There is a chance that if it's not Brian Robinson that's cut, there's a number of other interesting names. Even Kenneth Walker, for example, who may not be 100% healthy at the start of the season on that roster. They have Melvin Gordon, Devin Singletary. Sean, I hope there's some cuts on that roster because we can spend our budget there to get those guys on board. Evan McPherson goes off the board. Paris Campbell goes off the board. Again, we're in a pretty flat zone. I know we took David Bell. Is there anyone that you're thinking about making that reach first? Sony Michel was somebody who I had recently added to the queue. He goes off the board. But we do have Ronald Jones, Ty Chandler, Rex Burkhead, Trey McBride as a late potential tight end. And then we have the kickers. So we're back on the clock. This feels like a spot, Sean, where we could pivot to the kicker position.
Well, we had a situation where the team right after us, when we took David Bell, took Samaje Perine. So he did not go at the very end of this particular draft. That team also took Chris Evans. Going to have the Bengals backup in all likelihood.
They actually have Mixon as well. So they have all 3 Bengals.
So they're going to score some Bengals running back points. We have 25 seconds. We're not feeling any pressure. It's the late rounds. We know Harrison Butker's there. Tyler Bass is there. I mean, what's the best karma, though? And if you're going to win the $1 million, don't you want to do it with Ronald Jones on the roster?
Yeah, the reason I'm so calm, Sean, and you can change it if you want, Ronald Jones is at the top of the queue. I have no concerns here at this point. If you can filibuster all you want today.
So call him not concerned about the timeout with his guy Rojo there at the top.
We're going to go down, Sean. Like, I have made this now. Like, I'm going until Ronald Jones retires. I'm going down with that ship. There's going to be a season where it works out for us, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, you have to put him on the roster with your last pick every time. just because good things come to people who believe and who are sending those positive vibes out into the universe. We're sending them to Ronald Jones. It's a little unclear why we would have picked him out specifically to send good vibes to, but I mean, he feels like he needs it.
The only people sending those good vibes are me, you, and Pat Curran. There's only 3 people that are sending those good vibes to Ronald Jones.
Yeah, and family and
oh well, family, yeah, but that are, we're the real people, Sean, that are really sending those good vibes.
Right.
We're the people who really care.
Well, I think everyone who drafted Clyde Edwards-Helaire in Dynasty a couple years ago and has subsequently and angrily handcuffed him with Ronald Jones, they're probably also sending the good vibes out there because they know Clyde Edwards-Helaire is not going to be the guy who wins their league for them. There's been a lot of talk about Rojo. Would he be cut? Would it be better if he were cut? You look at some guys who were cut and now actually it seems to have rehabilitated their value in terms of Kenyon Drake, Sony Michel, maybe being on the Baltimore Ravens. That was the other team that I was really looking at and thought that it made sense. I thought that it made sense for the Ravens to trade for Ronald Jones last year. To have it be a situation now where Kenyon Drake gets to play in that offense instead of Jones is a little bit frustrating. So maybe there was a better scenario for Jones, but I like him on the Chiefs because the Chiefs don't have a guy. Those other 3 players are role players in all likelihood. As a Chiefs fan, I'm contractually obligated, and much more than contractually, I'm emotionally obligated to coming up with a way to defend any of the really exciting narratives that their coaching staff can come up with. Right now, that narrative is with Isaiah Pacheco. I hope that that works out. He can get his size, speed package pointed toward the goal line as opposed to pointing toward opposing defenders. So when I say that Ronald Jones is the only way it plays out and you have a star, that's obviously not true. Those other guys, all 3 of them have cool things. Who then we took Jerick McKinnon earlier in this draft because he was one of the real hammers in last year's reality playoff portion. They've got a lot of athleticism. It's not impossible, especially now he's so cheap. It's not impossible that Clyde Edwards-Helaire could come through. But I like Jones in this offense because after the other guys have failed those first couple of weeks and they get Ronald Jones out there and he breaks one into the secondary and he goes for 70 yards, I just don't see how he doesn't play. And I also kind of like the fact, one of the concerns with Jones is that, and I think this is especially relevant in best ball where any points can sometimes be very helpful. For managed leagues, I like the fact that he may be inactive, and that gives you a very strong signal, conclusive, I would say, to not play him that week. And if we can get a sense of who the Chiefs' backs are going to be from a touch perspective by who is active in any given week, maybe that helps us play it as, you know, managers in a managed league. So I like that. We have Ronald Jones. We have Jerick McKinnon. We get that Chiefs exposure. We get it without paying very much. Sometimes when you don't pay very much, you have a lot more upside related to price. Sometimes when you don't pay very much, you guys aren't very good, which that's kind of what the market is telling you. But I do like having some Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. And you mentioned a point there. There's a lot of talk around having the 4 running backs in the roster, but there's a good chance that if they're not active on special teams, they would be inactive on game day if that is the situation. And we should have some clarity around that before game time, which would be beneficial, obviously, to the way we have constructed this backfield. But yeah, more Ronald Jones. I can't believe it. We've done it again. We'll see, Sean. We are 2 picks away. We've talked about Tyler Bass for quite some time now. I'm just going to ask you again. Dearness Johnson is there as a potential option, but defense kicker time?
Yeah, I do want Bass here. I hope he makes it 2 more spots.
Yeah, I think it'll be. We were kind of thinking about it 2 rounds ago. So 2 picks to go. Wait to hear the sigh as Tyler Bass goes off the board is probably the next thing that's going to happen. If it's a case that he's not there, is there any other guys that you're interested in here? Daniel Carlson, Matt Gay would be potential options as well.
Yeah, anybody that you want to draft at kicker is fine. And Gay also gives us the chance to come back with a second kicker.
We don't have to worry about it, Sean. We don't have to worry about it anymore.
We don't. Bass comes to us. We will select him. We have 2 picks remaining. You just really want to win in week 1. You want to get off to that 1-0 start. We know that one of the things that we have done here is take on a little bit of early season uncertainty that usually is then reflected in late season upside, but we don't want to get off to the slow start. So if we get boxed out of the rest of our picks, we know we're going to be having a big week 1 free agent bid almost regardless of what we do. You cut one of your kickers and it's emotionally very easy. Sometimes you don't bid aggressively enough if you want to see all 18 of your skill position players again in week 2. You can also cut some guys that you like. Connor and I were discussing the other day that one of the things that can occasionally help you in best ball is that you can't cut the players that your full year, that 8 months of analysis told you those guys are going to be really good. They get a little bit of a nagging injury in the first couple of weeks. You let them go and they come back and really rampage in the fantasy playoffs. You feel silly. You feel frustrated. If they score enough, you may even be distraught that you lost those players. Sometimes patience is valuable, but if you're the team that gets the week 1 pickup, not only do you have the most sort of new information that wasn't out there before after the week 1, after week 2, but you get to play that guy for the longest period of time, especially if it's someone who's going to be a clear starter. The value of being willing to bid up. Colin, what's the biggest bid that you have made after week 1 in an FFPC league?
Yeah, I would say maybe 70%, which didn't work out. I've tried to erase that from my memory.
It sounds that way. My highest bid was for Alfred Morris after the first week of his rookie year.
You brag now. You tell us how you picked up Alfred Morris.
Well, your story wasn't any good.
My story was terrible, but
958, Colin. I had 42 to work with for the entire rest of the season. And talk about bragging. Basically, it's just lucky it worked out, right? Because he was going to be your 1 play for that year. It was on a 0 RB team, and it did help a lot.
Sean with a humble brag. We are actually back on the clock with our discussions. We are back in the mix. So we are we're tempted here to go with 2 kickers to see how things go in week 1. Do you want to do that in the last round, or do we want to go here with a defense at this point where there is some interesting options? I often like when we get out of the elite defenses to target defenses that teams are going to put up points. In that situation, Kansas City are probably the highest likely to score points, but we have the Patriots and Philadelphia in there as well. But I'm probably willing at this point to bypass the defense for that second kicker if you want to do it, or I'm easy. I have no strong preference at this point.
Well, let's go with Tennessee here in the good week 17 matchup. And that also kind of keeps us open for not the good week 1 matchup, I should say.
I was wondering, I thought you've been very confident.
Yeah, we're just going to play Tennessee for 17 weeks. Pretty confident that's going to be the highest scoring defense.
Yeah.
No, they have the good week 1 matchup. That's what is relevant on the defensive side. And that way we kind of know whether or not we're going to want to spend the 20th round pick on a position player or on the kicker. The 2 guys I still really like here, Ty Chandler, Trey McBride.
Yeah, I also think that the week 1 play, like realistically, we want to be playing Tyler Bass up until his bye week in week 7, based on how we expect the kicker position to go. So whoever we do pick up, we're probably, things could go differently, but we're probably not thinking about holding them on the roster for a long period of time. So we'll see what options are there. Yeah, Ty Chandler and Trey McBride are certainly in play as well. So this is obviously the most exciting time for people to listen into these drafts, Sean, when we're at the kickers and defenses portion. But I guess when we're waiting to see when it comes back around, we can do a run through what we have ended up with as a roster. So at quarterback, we have Justin Fields, Trey Lance. Then we have Rashad White, Ronald Jones, Rashad Penny, Jerick McKinnon, Raheem Mostert. At wide receiver, we have DK Metcalf, Deontay Johnson, CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Brandon Ayuk, David Bell, Romeo Doubs, Devontae Smith. At tight end, we have Kyle Pitts, Gerald Everett, and then we have Bass and the Tennessee defense. So, yeah, I'm pretty excited with how this has turned out. There's only a couple of picks that we've gone back to a few times, the Mooney and Bateman picks. So we potentially could have had them over Metcalf and Ayuk, but I think all things considered, that has worked out. What are your thoughts? Obviously, we have one pick to go. What are your thoughts, though, on how we've built this out? And I think it's fair to say this is a true zero RB roster.
A true zero RB. We don't get our first running back until round 8. We have the 6 big-time wide receivers. We start with the elite tight end. We come back with Trey Lance in round 9. That gives us what we hope is an elite quarterback, but we pair him with Justin Fields to give ourselves 2 shots at that hybrid profile, the profile that is tournament-winning, world-crushing in fantasy. We like the running back upside that's on this roster. That doesn't mean those running backs are necessarily going to hit.
Yeah, but I think there's enough upside there, and we'll work those waivers to see how things play out. But yeah, it's an exciting build here. We're seeing some of those kickers go off the board. We are now into that decision point in 2 picks time as to, do we want to go with the kicker? Do we want to go with Ty Chandler or Trey McBride? Based on the kicker matchups in week 1, Sean, is there anyone here who is available that you have a strong lean towards? We have Indianapolis's kicker in Blankenship. We have Nick Folk. We have Younghoe Koo, Jake Elliott, Will Schultz. Any matchups that you're specifically targeting for that first week?
Well, I thought that Ryan Suckup in an explosive Buccaneers offense, they'd be at Dallas. The kicker situation can be tricky because you would like it to be on a high-scoring team in a matchup that you're probably not going to be chasing a huge number of points. You don't want to get into the second half and kind of be game scripted out at kicker.
Yeah.
I guess with where we are here and the specific kickers who are left, I would be probably leaning back toward taking Chandler or McBride.
Yeah.
If either of them blew up in week 1,
yeah,
that
would
feel kind of silly.
Yeah, no, and even with the tight end position, like there's reports that Zach Ertz potentially won't be there week 1, won't be active, or else will not be 100%. Then Ty Chandler, then there's the reports around Madison potentially being moved. So again, I have no Ty Chandler at this particular point in my drafts, but I have a huge amount of McBride. So I'm willing to leave this one up to you. We probably need the depth at running back more than we do at tight end, but maybe Ty Chandler has the upside to be that massive smash. I think that if McBride hits in week 1, there's going to be a lot of waiver budget spent on him.
So, Colin, we take Ty Chandler there. I think that was what you were arguing for.
I was kind of begging for somebody to. Usually, I need somebody to stop me from drafting Ronald Jones, and the other player is Trey McBride. So I need somebody to take the controls and not allow me to draft those guys.
Take the controls. Don't let Colin draft McBride. McBride goes 2 picks after us. He goes right in that same range. Someone else looking at it from a similar point of view. I have a huge exposure to McBride. I think on this particular team, the upside for Chandler, he was someone who was very good after transferring last season in the NCAA. He's back with elite speed. He was one of the best performers in the preseason. I've written a couple of different articles about him. One early talking about how he could be this year's Elijah Mitchell. One more recent in the bold predictions column that came out after the first week of the preseason, talking about how Alexander Mattison would be moved. I think that was the prediction. It was something to that effect, column. I don't know if you remember exactly.
I think it was that it was something to do with the second running back that you want to own on the Minnesota Vikings wasn't Madison.
And so now a couple weeks later, we're in that position. I don't know that there's any fire where there's smoke on Madison here, but I do think that someone like Samaje Perine should be going in the same range or ahead of Madison. I think he's got a better chance to be the Bengals handcuff than Madison does to be the Vikings handcuff. The players Madison is competing with for that role are just so much more athletic than he is, so much more dynamic. I think that in this new styled Vikings offense, they're looking for that dynamism. Chandler, obviously a pick of the new regime. We're only human, and that can work for and against players in some of these situations. The guys who are already on the roster, we watched how that worked out with the Raiders and some of their running back moves. The new brain trust in Minnesota, I have a lot of confidence that their overriding goal and really their entire focus is going to be on winning football games. But again, if you can win football games by making a late round pick who blows up and becomes your next starter, becomes Arian Foster or something to that effect, you can't help but bask in the glow of having made that pick. And so even if you're trying to keep yourself very balanced in the way that you look at how things are transpiring, those guys who are picked into that situation are just going to have the edge. And so I do like Ty Chandler as a final round pick. I like the backs who bring that explosive athleticism. It's weird, Colin, but those guys, as opposed to the big slow backs, do tend to be the ones who are undervalued. It has been a core principle in Zero RB to load up on extremely athletic players. There is a little bit of a dynamic where the big guys can be the preferred back on some of these coaching staffs. The coaches like when you break tackles and then fall down, as opposed to the Chris Johnson profile where you run to daylight, but then get shoestring tackle by the first guy, and the coach looks at like that guy's just not tough. So there's some human psychology too with how the running backs are actually deployed, where we're going to keep taking those elite athletes.
Yeah, so I'm again. We run through the full roster at this point, but I think we have, as the draft has gone on, we've kind of split it up a few times. I think it's fair to say, Sean, we're both on the pretty excited end of the spectrum in terms of how this has played out. We'll be talking about how the team is doing throughout the season. We may have another couple of these type of drafts before the season kicks off, or maybe even after that Thursday night game. We'll see what happens. But yeah, it's getting to the crunch time now, Sean. We're cramming those drafts in to finalize up the season. Hopefully we'll have some success stories when it comes to the end of the season, like we did last year. Hopefully we'll have some prize money coming our way. But that is going to do it for today's edition of the podcast. Thank you for everyone who listened in and listened to the draft. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully there's some nuggets in there that you find very interesting. And hopefully, as I mentioned, this team goes on